Summer 1944, France. When the Allied armies broke out of Normandy in July 1944, their speed astonished even themselves. In less than 3 weeks, the front had leapt from the bocage hedgerows to the open plains beyond Avranches. For the first time since D-Day, the horizon was wide, the roads clear, and the German army in retreat. But behind the roaring columns of tanks and half-tracks, another front was forming, silent, unglamorous, and absolutely decisive. It was the front of supply. Before the war, the German General Staff had scoffed at American logistics. They build trucks instead of soldiers, General Alfred Jodl quipped in 1942. To men raised on the doctrine of Bürgerkrieg, movement war, this seemed absurd. A fighting army, they insisted, must live off the land, seize what it needs, and move on. The Americans, they believed, were businessmen in uniform, bureaucrats with rifles. They will drown in their own paperwork before they cross the Seine, another staff officer sneered in a captured diary entry. They were not entirely wrong, at least not yet. By late July, the U.S. First and Third Armies were outrunning their own fuel. Each Sherman tank consumed nearly a gallon per mile, each division needed hundreds of tons of rations, ammunition, and gasoline every day. The French railways lay shattered by months of Allied bombing. Ports like Cherbourg were clogged with wreckage and sunken ships. And the Normandy beachhead, which had once been a miracle of amphibious supply, could no longer keep pace with an army that now stretched over 400 miles of road. At headquarters in St. Lo, staff officers stared at charts that told a story as grim as any battlefield report. The trucks were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. By mid-August, 90% of available vehicles were already on the road. Gasoline came in 5-gallon jerry cans stacked by the millions in open fields, guarded by MPs in prayer. Soldiers joked that they were fighting the Battle of the Gasoline Can. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army had become the spearhead of the Allied advance, felt the noose tightening. His tanks were cutting across France faster than the planners had ever imagined, 20, 30, even 40 miles a day, but every mile deeper meant more fuel lost to distance. Patton was blunt in his frustration. My men can eat their belts, but my tanks got to have gas. The Germans, watching from the retreating line, misread the pause that followed. To them, it was proof that the Americans were overextended and soft. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge wrote in his final report before his death, "Their tanks stand idle not from courage lost but from fuel gone. The Yankee cannot fight without his truck." The phrase spread like gospel through the Wehrmacht's remaining units in France. They did not yet understand that the Americans were not pausing, they were reorganizing. In the port cities, engineers cleared rubble and dredged harbors. At depots in Normandy, ordnance officers relabeled mountains of cargo by color code and priority. The Quartermaster Corps calculated, down to the last ton, how much gasoline Patton would need to cross the Seine and reach the Meuse. Then, on August 25, 1944, the same day Paris was liberated, a convoy system unlike anything in military history began to form. It would be called the Red Ball Express, a name borrowed from the American railroad slang for high-priority freight. Within days, it would grow into a living organism of engines, tires, and determination, a river of motion that pulsed 24 hours a day, rain or shine, through dust and wreckage. But on that August morning, it was still only an idea, a line on a map, a handful of routes marked one way east, one way west. Its drivers were mechanics, cooks, and clerks, most of them African-American soldiers who had been told they would never see the front. In the weeks to come, they would become the arteries of an army, the proof that mobility itself was a weapon. The German generals who once laughed at American supply would soon watch in disbelief as Patton's tanks refueled, rearmed, and resumed their advance, fed not by luck or plunder, but by the most disciplined chaos ever engineered. The battle for France was about to shift from steel to rubber, from the tank tread to the truck tire. And in that shift, the modern age of mechanized warfare would be defined. August 25 to 31, 1944, Normandy to Chartres. The Red Ball Express began with an order written in haste but executed with precision. On the afternoon of August 25, 1944, the U.S. Army's Motor Transport Service received Directive Movement Control No. 1, establish a continuous supply line from the Normandy depots at St-Lo and Isigny to forward dumps near Chartres and Dreux. The mission, simple in theory, Herculean in practice, was to move fuel and ammunition to Patton's Third Army faster than any logistical system in history had ever done. The first convoys rolled out before midnight. Their trucks were 2.5-ton GMC CCKWs, deuce and a halfs, as the soldiers called them, painted olive drab and loaded with 5-gallon jerry cans stacked like bricks. Each truck carried up to 125 cans, nearly 600 gallons in total, enough to move a single Sherman tank about 20 miles. That math would come to define the campaign. Military planners in the advanced section of the Communications Zone, ADSEC, drew the route as 2 parallel veins, one eastbound, one westbound. Red circles on the maps marked checkpoints. From these the convoy took its name. Red Ball, priority freight. Red Ball, no stops, no detours, no delays. Drivers were told to keep moving, day and night, headlights covered with blue filters, convoy lights blinking faintly in the dust. The first rule of the Red Ball was motion. The road itself was a marvel of improvisation. French civilians called it La Route Américaine. Beginning near St-Lo, it wound south past Alsace and Le Mans, then east toward Chartres and Dreux, a distance of more than 350 kilometers. Engineers blocked off crossroads, posted MPs at every junction, and marked bridges with signs reading Red Ball only. Civilian traffic was banned outright. From dusk till dawn, the road belonged to the trucks. Each convoy consisted of 50 to 75 vehicles spaced 50 yards apart. A white lead jeep flew a red flag, the tail carried a green one. In between were men like Private First Class Leroy Petty, age 19, from Birmingham, Alabama, who had been a cook 2 months earlier. "They told us we were gonna drive gas," he recalled after the war, "but they didn't tell us we'd be doing it under fire." More than 75% of the Red Ball's drivers were African American. The Army, still segregated, assigned black troops primarily to service roles, loading, repairing, and driving. Yet these same men would soon prove indispensable. By the end of August, 132 trucking companies were operating under the Red Ball system, 101 of them black. The 3,918th, 3,919th, and 3,920th Quartermaster truck companies became its backbone. They worked in shifts that seemed beyond human endurance. A typical driver ran 12 to 16 hours, slept in the cab, and returned west with empty cans to start again. Some logged 1,500 miles a week. Fuel dumps became landmarks by smell alone, the sharp tang of gasoline mixing with Normandy dust. In the dark, they navigated by taillight and memory, trusting that the convoy ahead would stay true. Mechanical breakdowns were constant. Tires shredded on rubble, transmissions burned out from overloading. But the ingenuity of the drivers bordered on miraculous. When spare parts ran out, they cannibalized wrecks by the roadside. When tires burst, they stuffed them with rags. One unit even fashioned a makeshift headlight from a ration can and a flashlight bulb. "If it rolls, it runs," their sergeant said. Enemy action added to the peril. German fighter bombers still roamed the skies, and Luftwaffe strafing raids occasionally hit the columns. Near Le Mans, 2 trucks were destroyed in a single pass by FW-190s. The next day, the road was back in operation. "You could bomb a bridge," a German prisoner later admitted, and by morning, the Americans had built a new one. Within its first week, the Red Ball Express moved over 12,000 tons of supplies. By August 31, Patton's tanks were rolling again, cutting across the Seine toward Reims. The laughter of the German general staff had faded into disbelief. To them, the convoys seemed endless, ghostly lines of trucks glimmering through the night, headlights dimmed but never extinguished. They called it der Rollen Nachschub, the rolling resupply. They did not yet know that this flow of fuel and steel, this anonymous tide of motion, would soon outpace every timetable in the war. And as the columns pushed eastward, one lesson became clear: the true engine of the American advance was not the tank or the airplane, it was the truck, and the men behind its wheel. September 1944, on the road to Reims. By early September 1944, the Red Ball Express had become a world unto itself, a separate front defined not by gunfire but by dust, diesel, and fatigue. Its soldiers called it the Iron River. Historians later called it the greatest truck convoy operation in history. To those who lived it, it was simply work, endless, grinding, vital. The convoys now stretched from Normandy's beaches to the heart of liberated France, a route pulsing 24 hours a day. At any given moment, more than 6,000 vehicles were in motion. To the German army, it seemed an impossibility, an army that refueled itself in real time, without pause or plunder. Yet the system ran because men made it run, men who refused to stop. Most of them were African American. They were the labor soldiers, the men whose names never appeared on propaganda posters or in newspapers. Many came from Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, farmhands and mechanics drafted into segregated units that the Army had once considered unfit for combat. Now, they were the lifeline of Patton's advance. Without them, General Dwight D. Eisenhower later said, we could not have moved. A typical Red Ball driver carried two weapons, a .45 pistol and a wrench. The enemy they fought was exhaustion. Convoys moved day and night in 12-hour shifts, but the hours blurred together until the men lost count of them. They ate cold rations from their laps and slept sitting up, heads pressed against vibrating windows. Some claimed they could dream while still shifting gears. The roads were a chaos of motion, mud, wreckage, refugees, and the constant whine of engines. The drivers learned to read the landscape by vibration. They knew where the ruts began, where the bridges buckled, where enemy shellfire had cratered the pavement. Near Alassa, trucks bounced so violently that fuel cans split open, the smell of gasoline followed them for miles. The MPs who policed the route called them ghost convoys. In fog or blackout conditions, the trucks moved in near silence, the only light the faint blue glow of convoy lamps. It looked like a string of stars crawling through the earth, one officer recalled. The danger was constant: rollovers, collisions, fires. When a truck broke down, another driver towed it with a rope, unwilling to let the line break. Racism followed them even as they carried the war forward. At depots and rest areas, segregated mess lines remained in place. Some officers refused to credit black drivers for their tonnage hauled. But among the men on the road, respect was measured differently, by endurance. The soldier who could drive 40 hours without sleep, who could change a tire under artillery fire, who could coax a burning engine to the next checkpoint, that man commanded respect. Private Robert Snake Johnson of the 3918th remembered one night near Chartres when German planes strafed the convoy. They came down screaming, tracers cut through the dark like fireflies, he said in a 1985 interview. We hit the ditch, waited till it passed, then got right back in the truck. You didn't stop. You didn't even think about it. For every gallon delivered to Patton's tanks, someone had risked his life on that road. Each truck carried the fuel for one tank, each convoy carried the fate of a division. When gasoline ran low, men siphoned their own reserves to keep the last trucks rolling. If Patton's boys ran out, one driver said, we'd have to push them ourselves. The statistics tell part of the story: over 89,000 men, 5,958 vehicles, 12 million gallons of fuel hauled in just 6 weeks, but numbers can't capture the rhythm of it, the hammering of engines, the slap of tires on shattered stone, the strange brotherhood forged in motion. By mid-September, the Red Ball Express was more than a convoy. It was an artery of war, proof that mobility itself was a form of firepower. Patton's tanks no longer waited, they charged. Behind them, invisible but indispensable, came the men of the wheels, tired, grease-stained, uncelebrated, and unstoppable. September 1944, the Meuse Line. By the second week of September 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army stood on the threshold of the German frontier. Its tanks had thundered across France in a feat of speed unmatched in modern war, nearly 400 miles in 30 days. From Avranches to Verdun, the German 7th Army had collapsed before his advance. Yet, as Patton's spearheads reached the Meuse, their progress began to slow. Not from resistance, but from thirst, the mechanical thirst for fuel. Every tank, half-track, and truck in Patton's columns depended on a single artery that stretched back to the beaches of Normandy, the Red Ball Express. The general called it his lifeline, and he was right. Each day, his army required over 500,000 gallons of gasoline. At its peak, the Red Ball carried 12,500 tons of supplies daily, of which nearly 70% was fuel. Without it, Patton's armored divisions would have been monuments of steel, silent and stranded on the road to the Rhine. The Army's European theater staff, led by General John C. H. Lee, worked furiously to keep that from happening. From their headquarters in Chartres, the Advanced Section, ADSEC, scheduled convoys with mathematical precision. Every truck had a destination, every gallon an assigned purpose. The timing was relentless: gasoline by dawn, rations by noon, ammunition by dusk. The Red Ball, one officer wrote, was less a road than a bloodstream. To Patton, it was a matter of will. He had no patience for logistics as excuse. When informed that his fuel reserves would last only 48 hours, he replied, "Then I'll fight for 48 hours." When headquarters asked him to slow his advance, he snapped, "My tanks can't read memos." The tension between strategy and supply defined the Allied command through September. Eisenhower wanted a broad front advance, steady, balanced, methodical. Patton wanted a breakthrough into Germany. The Red Ball, caught in between, became the deciding factor. Every extra mile east meant an hour's delay for the trucks and a gallon less in every tank. At the depots near Reims, fuel was loaded continuously, day and night. Drivers filled jerry cans from 50-gallon drums, hands slick with gasoline, the air heavy with fumes. The ground was so saturated that matches were forbidden within 50 feet. Yet the work never stopped. "We had no choice," remembered Sergeant Calvin Carter of the 3920th Truck Company. "Patton's tanks were drinking faster than we could pour." By mid-September, Third Army's advance began to stall near Metz. German forces, reorganized under the First Army, stiffened their defense. Rain turned the roads to mud, slowing the trucks to a crawl. Still, the convoys pressed forward. Some drove 20 hours straight, headlights dimmed to avoid air attack. When bridges collapsed under the strain, engineers built new ones in hours, using Bailey panels hauled by the same Red Ball trucks. At one crossing near Verdun, a driver convoyed over a temporary bridge so narrow that mirrors had to be folded in. "If you looked down, you saw the river," he said later. So we didn't look. The German High Command struggled to comprehend how the Americans sustained such speed. General Heinz Guderian, reviewing reports from France, wrote bitterly in his notes, "They have made the truck their panzer. Their fuel is infinite." German supply columns, dependent on horses and captured vehicles, could not compare. The Wehrmacht's vaunted mobility had been outpaced by the very thing it once mocked: mass production. At SHAF headquarters, Eisenhower sent a memo to the War Department: "The Red Ball Express has become indispensable. It represents the decisive application of American industry to tactical movement." By the end of September, the Express had hauled over 100,000 tons of supplies in barely 5 weeks. Patton's fuel shortages persisted, but his army never broke contact, never lost momentum. Each can of gasoline delivered across France represented not just combustion, but continuity, a promise that American war power would not pause. The laughter of German generals, once certain that logistics would defeat democracy, had long since died in the roar of engines. What they could not grasp was that the United States fought its wars as it built its highways, with endless motion, endless means, and men who refused to stop. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Late September 1944, from Le Mans to Nancy. The Red Ball Express was never designed to last. What began as a stopgap measure, a 90-day emergency route, had become the backbone of the Allied campaign in Western Europe. By the end of September 1944, it was straining under its own success. The roads were rutted into canyons of mud and dust. Trucks broke down faster than they could be repaired. Drivers slept less, worked more, and lived on coffee, cigarettes, and determination. Yet still, the convoys moved. To the men who drove them, the Red Ball was less an operation than a test of endurance. They called it steel and sweat logistics. The steel came from Detroit, the sweat came from everywhere else. On a damp morning near Le Mans, a column of the 3,918th Quartermaster Truck Company rolled out under a drizzle that turned the road into paste. Each truck groaned under 5 tons of gasoline in jerry cans. Drivers hunched over the wheel, eyes burning from exhaustion. "We didn't think about sleep," recalled Corporal Willie Alexander. Sleep was for when the truck broke down. Maintenance became a form of combat. Tires shredded on rubble, engines overheated, brakes failed on steep hills. Each driver carried a basic toolkit, but ingenuity was the true repair manual. Fan belts were replaced with rope, transmissions were coaxed back to life with wire and prayer. When engines died entirely, crews cannibalized other trucks to keep at least one moving. "If it ran, it rolled," Sergeant Luther Williams said. The depots, too, were a theater of war. At the great dumps outside Le Mans, engineers worked under floodlights, stacking drums in geometric rows that stretched to the horizon. Quartermaster records list 3.2 million gallons of gasoline stored at Depot 520 alone. Yet even that was only a few days' supply. The logistical appetite of the Allied Army was beyond precedent. A single armored division required 350,000 gallons per week. Patton commanded 5 of them. In the field, the fuel arrived as a kind of deliverance. Tank crews, stalled for hours, would cheer when they saw the olive-drab trucks approach, each marked with a Red Ball insignia hastily painted on the door. They called the drivers the angels with gas. Soldiers lined up with jerry cans, hands slick with mud and fuel, as the drivers poured liquid motion into the veins of the army. "You could smell victory before you saw it," one tanker remembered. Enemy resistance grew sharper as the convoys pushed east. German artillery occasionally shelled the roads near Nancy. Luftwaffe night raiders hunted the convoys, dropping flares to silhouette the trucks. On September 27, a column of the 3,920th was ambushed near Atain. 3 trucks were destroyed, 4 men killed. Yet within hours, replacements had taken their place. "They bombed the road at midnight," an officer reported, "and by dawn, we were running again." The physical toll was staggering. Medical records show that by late September, over 1/3 of all Red Ball drivers suffered from fatigue-related ailments, stomach ulcers, blurred vision, trembling hands. Yet discipline held. The camaraderie among drivers replaced the formal command structure, units blurred into one rolling brotherhood. "We didn't salute rank," said Private Henry Stokes. "We saluted mileage." Amid the hardship, there were moments of strange beauty. At night, the convoys stretched for miles, a river of dim blue lights winding through liberated France. The sound, thousands of engines in unison, became a kind of music. Even German prisoners, forced to watch from the roadside, were awed. "It was like seeing a factory move," one later said. By the end of the month, the Red Ball Express had hauled more than 120,000 tons of supplies, enough to fuel the entire Allied drive to the German border. What had begun as improvisation had become industrial rhythm. Still, the men knew the limits of their endurance. "We ain't machines," one driver told a reporter in October. "But this war needs us to act like we are." They did. And because they did, the tanks of the Third Army kept rolling, across rivers, through ruined towns, toward the frontier that had once seemed unreachable. The road east was long, but for the men of the Red Ball, stopping was never an option. October 1944, Nancy to the German border. By early October 1944, the map told one story, the fuel gauges told another. The U.S. Third Army stood poised before the Moselle and Saar rivers, ready to lunge into Germany. But the tanks were running dry. The fuel dumps at Le Mans were still 400 miles behind, and the Red Ball Express, already running 24 hours a day, was at its breaking point. What kept the Army moving in those critical weeks was not a plan on paper, but an act of improvisation on a continental scale. The official orders read like arithmetic: 350 gallons per tank per day, 2.5 gallons per truck per mile, 10,000 trucks on the road. But the men behind the wheel understood it as a heartbeat. "We weren't delivering fuel," recalled Private Ernie Lucas of the 3913th Truck Company. "We were pumping blood." As the lines stretched eastward, secondary depots sprouted like forward organs. Nancy became the new hub, a logistical heart pulsing through mud and smoke. At dawn, its rail yards glowed with signal lamps, freight cars clattering with gasoline drums, ammunition crates, and rations. Engineers built temporary pipelines from the railheads to roadside storage fields, where Red Ball convoys loaded directly under fire-blackened skies. By mid-October, a typical day saw over 6,000 trucks in motion along the route between Le Mans and the Moselle. Quartermaster figures recorded 3.5 million gallons of gasoline delivered in the first 2 weeks alone, enough to move an armored division 1,000 miles. Yet the true miracle lay not in numbers, but in endurance. The weather turned foul. Rain swallowed roads and turned fields into bogs. Tires vanished in mud, engines drowned, and men worked knee-deep in filth to winch their vehicles free. But the trucks kept coming. "You didn't stop for rain, you didn't stop for breakdowns," said Sergeant Arthur Brooks. "You kept it moving, or someone went hungry, or worse, ran out of gas under German guns." At Metz, the 4th Armored Division paused to refuel amid shellfire. The Red Ball trucks arrived in the middle of an artillery barrage, drivers refusing to stop until the last jerrycan was unloaded. Colonel Wendell Blanchard of 3rd Army Logistics later wrote, "I saw men drive through bursts of 88mm fire without flinching. They knew that if Patton stopped, the whole front stopped." To the Germans watching from the hills, the spectacle defied logic. Wehrmacht intelligence officers estimated that the American advance would stall for lack of supply by late September. Yet in October, they watched convoys roll past Nancy, day and night, without pause. A captured German general remarked during interrogation, "We did not believe the Americans could feed an army so far from their ports. It was a machine we could not comprehend." That machine, of course, was human. The Red Ball drivers, 3/4 of them African American, labored under pressure that no textbook could describe. They ate standing up, slept sitting in their trucks, and repaired engines by lantern light. In one 24-hour period, some drivers logged over 400 miles on roads cratered by retreating Germans. "We didn't see ourselves as heroes," said Private First Class James Carter. "We were just trying to keep the gas flowing. But when you saw a tank crew wave as you pulled in, you knew what it meant." At headquarters, logistics officers began to think of the Red Ball as a living organism, flexible, adaptive, tireless. Convoys rerouted around destroyed bridges within hours. When German saboteurs mined a section of highway near Verdun, engineers built a bypass in a single night using Bailey Bridge sections and bulldozers. Military police regulated intersections like arteries, directing the constant pulse of traffic. By late October, the Red Ball Express had delivered more than 160,000 tons of supplies since its creation. General Patton himself, reviewing a convoy outside Nancy, saluted a passing truck and said simply, "Without you, we'd still be in Normandy." The drivers didn't hear him. They were already gone, heading east again, the rumble of their engines fading into the cold autumn rain. In the end, the Red Ball Express was not about trucks, or fuel, or even victory, it was about momentum. America's industrial heart had learned to move on wheels, to push steel and gasoline faster than any army could advance. And on those roads through France, soaked in oil and mud, the Red Ball drivers proved that logistics was not the backline of war, but its beating heart. November 1944, Lorraine to the German frontier. By November, Europe's autumn had turned gray and bitter. Fog settled low over the valleys, and sleet slicked the cobblestones of towns whose names blurred together: Nancy, Metz, Saarburg. The front lines crept eastward, but the men who kept the advance alive were fighting a quieter, colder war, the struggle to keep the supply road open when everything, weather, fatigue, even time, seemed to conspire against them. The Red Ball Express was no longer the bold experiment it had been in August. It was now an institution, a ghost road that never slept. Its signs, red circles on white boards, were still posted at junctions, but the paint had faded and mud streaked the arrows. The trucks that thundered past carried fewer fresh coats of olive drab and more patches, bullet holes, and the grime of 1,000 miles. Yet they kept moving, their engines coughing through the mist like the lungs of an exhausted runner. The war had reached a stage where fuel was worth more than gold. 1 gallon of gasoline could decide whether a tank crested a hill or sat useless under German artillery. To protect the lifeline, the army introduced a new system, block convoys. Instead of endless streams of individual trucks, vehicles now traveled in self-contained units of 40 or 50, each with its own mechanics, guards, and medical truck. The change cut delays and allowed entire groups to be rerouted on short notice, a crucial advantage as the front approached the heavily defended Siegfried Line. But the dangers multiplied. German fighter bombers prowled the skies again, operating in quick slashing raids from hidden airfields. On November 11, a convoy near Saarbrücken was strafed by Focke-Wulf 190s, leaving 6 trucks burning and 2 drivers dead. The survivors didn't stop, they pulled the wrecks to the roadside and pushed on. If one truck stopped, 50 behind it might die, said Sergeant Henry Wallace of the 3857th Quartermaster Truck Company. The rain didn't let up. The so-called Ghost Road between Verdun and Metz turned into a river of mud. Men slept in their trucks with water dripping through the canvas roofs. Some units used captured German half-tracks as tow vehicles, others replaced punctured tires with mismatched wheels scavenged from wrecks. Maintenance companies set up roadside repair pits every 20 miles, manned day and night by grease-smeared mechanics who worked by flashlight and prayer. Every truck was a story, recalled Lieutenant Vernon Scott, an officer with the 7th Army's logistics branch. You could tell where it had been by the dents and the smell, cordite, oil, sometimes blood. But each one carried something a soldier at the front needed, so it kept rolling. And still, morale held. Letters home spoke of exhaustion, but also of pride. The Red Ball had become a badge of honor, rough, dirty, but essential. When the Army tried to phase out some routes in late November to conserve vehicles, drivers protested. "We'd driven too far to stop," one report quoted. Behind the lines, the depots at Nancy and Luxembourg City became fortresses of movement. Trains from Cherbourg and Le Havre arrived hourly, unloading thousands of tons of ammunition, rations, and replacement parts. Bulldozers and cranes worked under floodlights, feeding the convoys like a giant mechanical heart. "You could hear it," said one engineer. The whole operation had a sound, the rumble of trucks, the clank of fuel drums, the shouts of men who hadn't slept in 2 days. It was the sound of America in motion. As the front neared the German border, even the generals began to grasp the sheer magnitude of what the Red Ball had accomplished. In 1 month, the trucks had moved more tonnage than the entire French railway system had in 1940. No army in history, Eisenhower remarked in a letter to Washington, has ever moved and supplied itself at such speed over such distance. The road was wearing out, the men were wearing thin, but the mission endured. The Red Ball Express was no longer just a supply system, it was a symbol of persistence itself. Even as winter closed in, even as rumors of a German counterattack circulated through the ranks, the convoys rolled on. Their lights were dimmed for security, their engines muted by wet air, but their presence was constant, a ghostly procession threading eastward through the dark. And somewhere beyond the fog, the Rhine waited, a gray ribbon on the horizon, marking the edge of the war's next chapter. The men of the Red Ball didn't know if they'd make it that far. They only knew one thing, until someone told them otherwise, the road went on. December 1944, spring 1945. Winter came to Europe like a punishment. The Ardennes froze solid, rivers crusted with ice, and the Red Ball Express became a skeleton of what it had been, a system stretched to breaking by exhaustion and frost. trucks struggled to start in the mornings, fuel thickened into syrup in the drums. Still, the convoys moved. They always moved. When the Germans struck in mid-December, the Ardennes counteroffensive, soon to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, the front bent dangerously. Surprise attacks tore through the thin American lines. Thousands of men were cut off. Eisenhower's staff at SHAF knew that if the Allies were to recover, fuel and ammunition had to reach the frozen front faster than the Wehrmacht could advance. That task fell again to the Red Ball veterans, now reinforced by new units pulled from depots, construction battalions, and even airbase support crews. Convoys were rerouted north through Reims and Liège under blackout conditions, their headlights painted over, guided only by reflective tape on the trucks ahead. Drivers called it running blind. German paratroopers and infiltrators were reported in the woods. Some convoys were ambushed, others bombed from the air, but the majority made it through. On December 21, a column of 150 trucks reached Bastogne, delivering fuel, blankets, and food to the encircled 101st Airborne Division. The last 30 miles were under artillery fire. "You could hear shells walking down the road behind us," recalled Private Leonard King of the 3908th Quartermaster Truck Company. "We just kept driving. Stopping wasn't an option." For a time, the Red Ball Express became more than logistics, it became a lifeline to survival. When Patton's Third Army pivoted north to relieve Bastogne, the trucks followed in his wake, refueling tanks on the move, distributing jerry cans directly to the front-line crews. It was the same formula that had carried the Americans across France: movement, endurance, and nerve. By January 1945, the German offensive had failed. But the Red Ball Express paid dearly for its part. Records show that more than 2,500 trucks were lost to accidents, enemy fire, and mechanical breakdowns between August 1944 and February 1945. Dozens of drivers never came home. They were not listed as combat casualties, though many had died in combat conditions. "We weren't on the front lines," said Sergeant Major Edward Smith years later, "but we were close enough to hear them." As spring approached, the convoys resumed their eastward surge. The temporary highways that had begun in Normandy now extended deep into Germany. Bridges destroyed by retreating Wehrmacht engineers were replaced within days by U.S. Army engineers. The trucks that had once carried gas from Cherbourg were now delivering it to the Rhine and beyond, to Mainz, Frankfurt, and Wiesbaden. On March 7, 1945, when American troops captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the first convoys of the Red Ball rolled across behind them. The war had turned decisively. Within weeks, the same trucks were hauling food for liberated civilians and fuel for occupation forces. The red circle signs that had marked the express began to disappear. One by one, the convoys were dissolved, the trucks reassigned or scrapped. The road that had once pulsed with ceaseless motion fell silent. In all, the Red Ball Express delivered more than 412,000 tons of supplies between August 1944 and March 1945, fuel, food, ammunition, and hope. It had kept the Allied armies moving through terrain that Napoleon, Caesar, and the Kaiser had never conquered so swiftly. After the war, the story faded quietly. No medals were struck for truck drivers. No parades celebrated the men who carried gasoline through shellfire. Yet the legacy endured, in the lessons of mobility, coordination, and sheer human will that shaped modern warfare. The Red Ball Express proved that victory was not only won by those who pulled the trigger, but by those who kept the trigger supplied. In 1985, at a reunion in Hawaii, a surviving driver named Thomas Jefferson summed it up for the last generation who remembered: "They said armies travel on their stomachs." Maybe so. But that year, in France, they traveled on our wheels. The Red Ball Express vanished with the war it sustained. But its echo, of roaring engines, muddy boots, and endless determination, remains the sound of an army that learned to move faster than history itself.